Hello, this is Nihigami, and I'm going to make a quick video on how to group and tank in Elite Dungeons 1. For my gear and supplies loadout, I'm using tier 80 armor with a tier 90 main hand weapon and shield. I recommend at least having tier 80 gear so you don't constantly eat while tanking the larger mobs. In this loadout, I'm using Pernix armor with Nightmare gauntlets, an Ascension crossbow, and a Vengeful kite shield. I recommend having the Invention perk mobile on one of your pieces of armor, which reduces the cooldown of Surge by half. This makes it much easier to round up mobs without tanking an excessive amount of damage. For everything else not mentioned, I recommend the best in slot that you currently own. For the supplies, I'm using Holy Overloads with Replenishment Potions. I highly recommend Replenishment Potions over Super Restore Flask because of the Adrenaline Potion aspect. It's extremely helpful for building adrenaline when needing to use defensive abilities with the larger mobs. I also bring Mechanized Chinchampas, and when combined with the Scrimsaw of Vampirism, allows for a significant amount of healing when doing damage to group mobs. For food, I recommend at least having sharks, otherwise you risk running out of food in the middle of a run. While this doesn't happen remotely often, making mistakes is punishing when tanking, and having good food helps recover from it. I also bring a blue charm to dedicate a space for my charming imp to pick up drop charms, and a replacement pouch when your familiar is about to run out. The rest of this video is going to be a commentary and a walkthrough of one of the runs that I did tanking for ED1. As a first note, you're going to notice that my supplies and everything is different because I was doing DPS earlier. I did bring out a switch in case they wanted me to do this, and here I am. I also want to note that this run was actually quite sloppy on my part. There were things that I should have done that I did not do, and it results in me taking a lot of damage. So I'll go through that and tell you what not to do, as I find that sometimes more important than what to do. You want to round up all of the mobs and just bring them back to your teammates. If you group them along the stairs that we came down to this area in, they group up quite nicely and just allows for a mass amount of damage to be taken to them, or given to them. On a side note, when it comes to being a DPS in this situation, it's very important that you never stand in front of the tank, otherwise you're going to be taking all of the damage from the mobs. The way that mob tanking in ED1 works is that whoever's closest takes the damage. And you'll see here that my friend Gingerbeard decides to walk up in front and actually dies quite fast. It's really important not to underestimate the amount of damage that these mobs do, which is why I highly recommend at least having tier 80 gear if you're going to tank. Cycle through your defensive abilities. At this particular part, I highly recommend using Barricade and Reflect, as they are abilities that just reduce overall damage, rather than a spell like Devotion, which reduces one type of damage. This next part is pretty self-explanatory, but to start, you need to tell your DPS teammates to stand back, and that's because you're going to be aggroing every mob that you can in this dungeon, and you're going to be creating a formation that's really easy to do AoE damage. In order to do that, though, they cannot be taking any aggro of the mobs you're bringing. This first part is pretty simple, but it also illustrates one of the first mistakes that I make. So as you can see here, I'm have a curse active that's mitigating the range damage, but after that point where I surge, you need to start praying mage or protect from mage. And that's because hardly any of the mobs that you're going to be facing are actually ranged mobs. At this point, you want to try and weasel your way around the melee mob. Grab the mobs in the corner first and then aggro the melee mobs. Sometimes it can't be helped and you'll aggro them anyways, but it's really nice when you can manage to not pull them before the corner. And once you have everybody aggroed, you're going to bring all the mobs back up to your teammates. There's a specific spot that I like to stand in order to create the largest formation. That's here at the top right part of the stairs, and I'll show you that when I get there. At this point, it's really important to keep your adrenaline high, as you're going to be needing it for the next part. So I make another really big mistake at this part. I actually make quite a few mistakes. The first one is that I actually have my threshold abilities toggle automatically with Revolution. I highly do not recommend that when you're tanking these mobs, because there's a lot of times where you're going to need the adrenaline to use your defensive abilities, and if you don't have it, it can mean eating a lot of food that you don't have to. At this point, there's a couple of things that need to be noted. For one, every step closer that you walk towards the mob, you're going to be taking the damage of two more mobs, or two more enemies. And so it's really important to manage the distance you have from the group. Otherwise, if you walk too close, you're going to be taking a lot of damage that you don't have to. The second thing is that you need to be mindful of the damage that you're taking. As you can see here, I'm obviously taking a lot of range and magic damage. For the most part, I really should be praying mage though, because the mage abilities tend to just hit a lot harder than the ranged abilities that the enemies do. At this point, using Ice Asylum and Barricade are very useful, though I recommend that you ask your DPSers to use Ice Asylum. As a quick side note, this is one of the moments that I like to use my Chinchampas just to get rid of the melee people, because it creates a situation. The melee guys do a lot of damage, but so do the ranged mobs in the back. So just getting rid of them as fast as possible can help save you a lot of food. At this point, the only thing that you have to do is just manage your distance in between you and the mob and slowly eat down at it. Eventually the mob does clear and you get to progress to the next part. This next part is actually really simple. At this point, you're going to be clearing out the church. One of the mistakes that I make here is that I'm actually praying range instead of magic. There's a lot more magic people or enemies than ranged, and so I highly recommend actually praying magic, not range there. At this point, I usually just stand here and let the mobs create the formation to do AoE damage, and at this point, you really don't actually have to move at all. If your DPSers do it correctly and they just attack the mobs in the front, every time a mob in the front dies, the people behind them walk forward to also take damage, or to actually attack. If done correctly, this allows for the highest amount of damage mitigation, and just helps conserve food. After you've cleared out the church, what you're going to do next is clear out all the mini bosses that the dungeon has. This part is actually much easier than tanking for the group mobs, because it's really easy to use your deflection curses just to mitigate all the damage. At this point, I also like to try to conserve as much adrenaline I have for the next section, as having a high amount of adrenaline makes things much easier. Once you've cleared all of the mini bosses out, you're going to progress to the last room and then do the next part. It's important to note at this point that every mob until for the rest of the dungeon up into the first boss are all going to be doing magic damage. So while you're cycling through your normal abilities, devotion is one of those abilities that's going to be added, as it negates all of the damage that you're currently praying to one. In this next section, you'll note a lot of mobs that can actually stun you, so using your anticipation and your freedom become very helpful here. As I said before, you really just want to take aggro of the mobs, stand in front of your DPSers, and really just do as much damage as you can. This next part's going to be very similar to what you did in the first section. You're going to be running through and taking aggro from all the enemies here and grouping them together so that you can do a lot of AoE damage to them. It's important that you cycle through Devotion, Barricade, and Reflect as you're doing this, because unlike the first part, all of these mobs, when you group them together, are going to be attacking you at the same time. They have such a large range that you can't necessarily block them behind each other. Also, getting these mobs to chase you can be kind of finicky at some points, because if you get too far away from them, they will drop aggro and just stand still. So a few times you're going to have to go back and re-aggro them. Once I've aggroed all of them, I try to line them up, and not in a straight line, but rather a cluster. And it takes quite a little bit of a feel to do that, but once you get the hang of it, it's quite easy. I kind of mess up here and actually create a divided group, but with a little bit of manipulation, it's really easy to actually get them into a cluster. For the sake of time, I didn't take the time to do it, though. At this point, it's really important to be cycling your defensive abilities without overlapping them. I think I actually do overlap them quite a bit at this part. I just highly recommend that you do not. So as you're going through here, be sure to beg your DPSers for an ice asylum, so you just don't eat through all of your food. And all you really do here is clear the mobs like you did before. At this point, when you kill the last mob, you're officially done with the mob farming, or at least for what we do. And if you've watched the entire video, I really appreciate it. Thank you for taking the time, and I really hope that this helps out in helping you learn to tank for your friends.